This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story.
Hey, Storyworks writers, if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love it if you could head over to wherever you get your podcasts and leave us an awesome review.
Hello, and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn, Robert, and I are going to discuss world-building religion, specifically. When do you need to have a religion as part of your story's culture? How much do you need to explain? What aspects of it are important to your story? How to pick those things? And Kathryn, I know this is an issue you've been dealing with. So anything else you want to introduce to us as we start getting into this topic?
No, I just think it's such an important part of culture, and I think sometimes we kind of skim over it, especially, if you don't really know what you're doing or how to build it or what embodies a religious structure, or if you haven't thought about it, it becomes kind of like an elephant in the room, sometimes like, oh, my characters believe something, I just don't know what they believe. And what to do with that at that point. So, yeah,
I think that's a great point to bring up, that notion of my characters believe something, but I don't know what it is. Because if we don't do our work as the writer to understand that part of our characters' family belief system, culture, inner world, from the sort of macro to the micro levels of that character, we can end up with kind of a black hole in that character's development, because religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs do shape so much of a person's worldview and thought processes and,
moral, ethical things. Or a lot of those are wrapped up into that, whatever their faith system is. So,
Yeah. Now, is this a genre-specific topic, or is it across all fiction?
I think it's across all fiction. I mean, I'm specifically wrestling with this in fantasy and speculative type works. But I think no matter what, religion is a part of the world today, right? It's a part of the world 400 years ago, 4,000 years ago. Faith systems, are part of people's lives. So whether you're writing a historical fiction, a contemporary fiction, maybe they were raised in a faith group that they no longer are a part of, that still is going to color, who they are as a person or as a character. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and it definitely it speaks to believability as well, doesn't it? Because the more accurate your touches are, if it's part of the story. I'm thinking specifically about the modern day thriller. It's not unusual now to find modern day thrillers that involve some form of extremism. And whilst that's very, very easy to then descend into Middle Eastern, tribal type feudalism or whatever, but it could come from anywhere. And you sometimes come across it as being quite heavy-handed, where it's a mass media view that's taken. And it's the times where it's really caught me by surprise, and I've enjoyed what I'm reading, when there's a little bit of thought gone into the antagonist's view of their religion, because it's a driver as well. So, it can definitely add to the cultural drivers and therefore motivation and therefore believability, I think. Because it's, for most of our world, for thousands of years, religion has been a driver of major change and, almost all conflict. So why wouldn't you think about it?
Right. And you raise a good point that it applies not just to the protagonist, but also to the antagonist. So they might not be part of the same religious cultures. And then there's more work we need to do as writers to get at those belief systems or values and motivations, and where they conflict and where they agree, So, Kathryn, I think you wanted to lean this discussion toward world building. So I want to...
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, that's where
let's go
I'm
there.
struggling with it. So sure, let's go there.
Yeah. So what are one or two of your current struggles, or what are you mulling over? What keeps you up at night, Kathryn?
I know, right? Welcome to the dark, dark world of Kathryn's brain, in which she cannot sleep. So therefore, she thinks about how to write sacred texts, what the names of different deities are, how much conflict there is in the spiritual world, whether or not it shows up in the day-to-day world of the character, how many religious systems are within different cultures and whether or not they clash, things like that. Specifically in the novel that I'm writing right now, I had to think, okay, like, do I want them all to be worshiping the same deity? No, I don't. So then, okay, how much do I have to come up with? How many different, what's my pantheon of gods look like, and how much do they interact? And that was a really tough, like, I realized how much stuff I want to have. And then that really kind of gave me a laundry list of things that I had to then come up with in order to make it a believable system that some main characters can participate in actively. So yeah, it was a lot of how does it look in the day-to-day lives? How does it affect the decisions that they make? Do they attend religious services? What does that look like? Are there, priests? Are there prophets? Are there temples? What is the structure? And then how it shows up, because it has to show up in their day-to-day lives, or else it's not worth, putting that much time and effort into, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. So how does one decide whether or not to invest that world building time and energy into the religious system? Is there criteria, or do we just say, well, I've got a society here, people need to believe in something, ergo there must be some kind of a religion or spirituality?
I would go back to what are my major crises through the story that pertain to the major elements of the plot. And if you're following, for example, say story grid method, there'd be 15 of them. But what it doesn't really matter which what you look at, whatever you think are the major turning points. And then I would say, okay, what aspect does my religious belief system play in that crisis? And if it has to play a really key point, then at some point you've got to show how that rule or dogma or cultural aspects play out every day, not necessarily in a painfully detailed way, but so that when you get to the crisis point, it's clearly going to be the decision problem, or it'll be heavily involved in the decision that protagonist or antagonist makes. So that's probably where I'd start. Is that would give me what level of detail do I need? Is this just a belief about life and death? Is it just a belief about whether I'm going to go to some heavenly location after dying, and so therefore it makes my valiant death perfectly fine? Or is it that at the moment of crisis somebody advises me that that's all been a sham and made up by the authorities just to get people to put up with the daily drudgery because they knew they'd be going to some place with flowers? So I'd probably be looking at major decision points first before I then built from the ground up and wasted a lot of time on painting big detail.
Yeah.
But then you might, as Kathryn has said as well, you might be writing a literary novel about the coming of age of someone who has struggled with Catholicism, for example, in which case clearly it's a major part of the theme even. So
yeah, I was going to say theme is a huge one. Like if you're dealing with any sort of thematic content that can touch on religion, oftentimes it will, because faith systems do inhabit our moral ethical center, and a lot of that can hit themes. So if you're dealing with that, then you're going to have some religion in there somewhere.
Yeah. So what about building a faith system from the ground up, as in a fantasy novel, versus writing, say, contemporary fiction or historical fiction, where you just know your characters would be part of a certain faith community? How much work do we need to do to reveal these elements to our readers?
I think that depends on your character, right? Because I think meet anybody in real life, right? And if they are part of a faith group, how much of it are you getting off of them, right? I mean, different levels of involvement, right? It doesn't necessarily, somebody could be really, really pious versus not, or, whatever, but you get it out of certain conversations, out of ways that they act, things like that. I think that's the sort of stuff that I'm really having fun digging into as I'm world building, is how does it affect the way that characters interact with each other, and then backfilling from that, into what the religious system looks like overall. I don't know if that makes sense.
I suppose also our the three dominant religions on the planet have essentially a very short set of rules to follow, and maybe behind that a value system on whether we're born with original sin or not. But so I suppose you'd also be thinking about what are the just start with the basics. What is it that people are being told to follow, or expected to follow, and then Kathryn's point about how does that individual character model that. Do they model that in a pious way, or do they pay lip service, or are they agnostic? Do they actively work against it? Are they atheistic? So I think it's really interesting. It would give some rich detail, because I think if you talk about how we're connecting it all together, then what we seem to be doing is saying it's all about how the characters interact and what they display and demonstrate, as opposed to just for description's sake, for example.
Right, and you can obviously use it in plot and in conflict and things like that, because religion in history historically has played a large part on the political and whatever else states, right? So you can ramp it up and use that as a huge part of your book and your whole conflict system, or you can play it down and just have it be a really character-centric moment or a thematic moment. But yeah, I mean, it's got a lot of flexibility through there, which is why you kind of have to look at it at least and decide if you're not going to use it, make that decision consciously, I think.
Right. And I think, the author's due diligence issue comes into play here as well. I was writing, so Evelyn is sent to the school for the feeble-minded in large part due to the intervention of a Methodist priest. See, here's my ignorance, right? So in my manuscript, I was calling him Reverend, because if you aren't father in the Catholic Church, you're a reverend in a Protestant church, right? But doing due diligence, I started Googling and found that reverend is an adjective, not a title, and he would actually be a vicar, and he would, you would not. And so, okay, I need to make some changes. I need to do a little more research. I need to shift how I think about him, because, if you let these details slide, you will have readers who catch them, and it will reflect poorly on you as well as on your story. Right. So thinking about the role of religion in our world and our society, it's so great, as you've been saying, Kathryn and Robert, that we need to think about its role in our stories as well, even if it's only slight, as in this case.
Right. And it's those details that really add the color and the texture to something. And we've talked a lot about believability, and doing your research on a religion, even if it only shows up for a little while, can really add to that believability, even if all you have to do is, I don't know, walk down to the local church and knock on the door and say, I don't know, what's your title?
Right. What are you called?
What do people call you?
I know.
So, but yeah, I think it's really important, and it adds a lot of depth.
Definitely. What other issues are you finding in world building your religion in this epic fantasy, where you're going from the ground up, and are you using our religions as a template? Are you really diverging from them greatly?
I struggled with that a lot. because I have my own faith system, right? I have my own beliefs, and I don't really want to preach from my own podium, like, so I really, I have a lot of knowledge of my own system. So then it's like, okay, so do I base it off of that? Because if I do, then all of a sudden I'm bringing in a whole truckload of things that I maybe don't want to deal with within my story.
Right.
Right. So I deliberately chose to veer, to take a very sharp turn and try and use my thematic content and kind of what I want the story to say to then build in my religious system, because I do want it to play a very large role. My magic system comes out of the religious system, like the whole thing. So I want to be able to have my protagonists interact with it in a meaningful way. So it's going to be a large part, and I knew it needed to be large. So I very deliberately said, okay, let's start from zero, literally zero. And then went from there. So it's been really fun to try and figure out, okay, how many gods do I want, and how do I want them to interact with people? And yeah, there's a lot of little things, but you can also do big broad strokes and kind of borrow from this, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And, maybe other fantasy novels that I've read or things that I liked. So just to kind of give it a little bit of depth without having to come up with it in completely whole cloth. So.
Right. And I don't know how we could really start at ground zero because we have so much in our minds, in our culture, even in our DNA, so to speak.
Well,
so
there's so many good resources for stuff like this too. I mean, you can just delve into fantasy lore, if you wanted to go there. I don't know, pick up a Dungeons and Dragons book and just start reading through their religious pantheons. I mean, there's just a lot of jumping off points that you can go from. If you don't want to hit actual historical religions, if you want to, pick up a book about Greek mythology or Roman mythology, or all those kind of fun, eccentric religions that you can kind of pull from. It's fun, and then you can kind of build off of that. So yeah, lots of resources available.
Have you built any religions, Robert?
No, as when we were talking about the episode and what to focus on, it's obviously clear that my belief system hasn't led me anywhere near it. so there's nothing. But having said that, there are clearly rules and beliefs that certain characters and definitely alien characters believe in and follow. So there's some, without realizing it, I've placed something in there, but nothing named, or not yet anyway. So interesting, because I've been reading some good books recently where, a belief system, not necessarily religion driven, but a very strong belief system has driven characters, major decisions and therefore have major consequences. So I can see that there's value in it because it gives you a more rounded character, of course. Right. Because it seems that it's a human thing to do, to have some relationship with something that's bigger than us. So whether we disbelieve it or believe it, it's probably more common that we find disbelief or belief as opposed to,
the absence of it.
Right.
So, it makes sense that they would be motivators in a story, and yet, I haven't got them explicitly. So it's a good thing to think about, because I think I must admit, I don't like books where that's overly detailed. It just, I like action books. So it tends to drive me. But clearly, I've also read some books where the action has been completely driven by a sect or a religious belief that's been fascinating, and you can't help but be drawn into it. But it has lots of touches. It's not one of those death by exposition things, which is, I think, the danger of, as Kathryn said, do I create a sacred text and then I'll put it in the foreword?
Right.
Hey, did you read that 300-page foreword?
Right, exactly. And that's where I think you build it and then you let your character embody it, right? So
Exactly.
Yes.
if your character is a practitioner of that religious system that you've created, then they are going to provide for the reader what the reader needs to know about the religion. You don't need to have them show up for a morning mass and be preached to for 15 pages about what needs to happen next. They just need to live it. And in a way that's, again, realistic, believable, part of their inner world, like Alida said.
Well, to me, that's the joy of constructing it in your own head, isn't it? If a couple of characters get up in the morning and one of them says, right, breakfast then, and the other one turns around and looks strange and says, well, we haven't put the candles out. Okay, so, there's something that they feel that they're ritualistic that they have to do every day. And so it immediately sets up some interest and conflict. So you don't necessarily have to say, but first we must, give our thanks to blah, 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 blah. It needs to be done in a straightforward, well, this is how I live my life. What are you talking about?
Right. And I think that's so key to good fiction generally, is showing the characters doing what they do, how they do it, and not trying to explain it to the reader.
It's the world-building iceberg.
Bob, I've been semi-Judaic for some 10 years now. I would have thought you'd realize that when I get up in the morning, I need to dress according to my religion.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So have you come up with, or do you have an example of, or what are you drawing on? Answer however you wish. But thinking of building your system of religion for your society, and then discovering how your characters live that and embody it. Talk a little bit about that, Kathryn. I think that's a great topic.
Okay. I might have to give examples from my writing. So I'm sorry if it gets a little bit in depth. I'll try to keep it simple. So my main protagonist, her name is Raya. In my novel, she is what I'm calling a creationist. So I have one creator, God, and then a bunch of deities that are under him. Okay. And she's a creationist, and so therefore she lives by a certain set of rules, etc. The other protagonist, I have a dual POV. His name is Kieran. He's also a creationist, but he is a creationist because he doesn't want to deal with the rest of the gods. And by calling himself a creationist, he therefore can just ignore everybody else because he's a creationist and therefore doesn't have to deal with them. So anybody else, any other gods or things that are going on in the culture, he can just be like, I don't participate in that because I'm a creationist. So he is out of, makes my life easy, versus her being more of a true believer. So being able to kind of put those against each other, I was able to say, okay, well, this is what defines her versus this is what defines the way that he interacts with it. So it was kind of fun to give them little things, habits, traditions, things that they do. And people call Kieran on it like, oh, why didn't you do that? And he's like, I didn't really care. I just, yeah, it was going on, but, there's no consequence for not doing it. So that's, out of his own thing. So again, there you get to see the characters interacting with it in a way that is kind of fun, right? And it also causes conflict between the two of them later because she gets to call him out and he gets to kind of have that moment with her where they get to have a discussion about that particular part of each of their characters, right? So yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but just being able to give them each little bits that kind of define their journey with the religion is what brings it down to that level within the character.
Yeah. Nice. Are you finding, so I think as writers, if you aren't doing world-based, reality-based fiction where everything is already defined for you, it could be difficult to come up with something that feels organic to your world you're building, but also fresh to a reader. So, something like genuflecting or lighting candles or, making the sign of the cross, only a different sign for a different world, right? But some sort of thing like that. Are you finding you can come up with new ways of building rituals into your world religions?
I think, again, it kind of depends on what you're trying to say. I've read books where you just know, okay, they took, for instance, Catholicism, and they just changed the names and they changed the symbols and they called it something different, but it's really just the same thing, right? And that's okay because it works for that book or that system or whatever. Maybe it's not front and center, or maybe it is and they're trying to say something about the Catholic Church. But, I tend to like to be very different, right? I don't like to I don't want people to be reading my book and think, oh, I know what she's referring to, right? I want them to get lost in it and just let it kind of flow past them, right? So whenever I find myself at a loss for, oh, I don't know what this is, and I want there to be this religious symbol or ceremony or something, but I don't want it to be this, I usually will like bracket it off in what I'm writing, and I'll just write similar to this, but not. And then I move on. But then what that does is it gets my brain thinking, and usually, 500-600 words later, I'm like, I got it. Like I can go back and insert this, and then it'll flesh out as I go. But I'll run into those kind of roadblocks where it's something I haven't thought of yet. And just giving myself kind of a touchstone to know what I'm looking for, but what I don't want it to mirror is really good and really helpful, because then it gets my brain kind of working through that problem. And we all know the power of our subconscious in creativity it's just, what you got to do sometimes is just leave it and let it be for a minute, so that you can move past that first thought or the second thought.
Yes.
And get into something original. So, yeah.
And so many, so many religious practices come from very practical things as well. So, whether it was to avoid famine or disease, or in problems with interbreeding, or, so a lot of those rule-based, or even just simple, ways that we live the day were designed to keep humans safe and surviving. So you can, if you've got already a system of magic, or you've got a cultural, the way that people behave, then you can think back to, okay, so what would be the religious laws or beliefs that would propel that? Why would they believe that? And why would that cause them to do that?
Yeah, going to the function, right? What was the function of that ceremony? What was the function of that? And then you can kind of think back, okay, so this is my world. This is how this would need to function. And then therefore, here comes the religious ceremony or practice or whatnot. Yeah, definitely.
I like that. Good stuff. Do either of you have final thoughts about world building with religion? All right.
I'm just living it right now, man. It's work, but it's worth it.
Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.